Okay, welcome to the second half of Romanticism. Actually, we haven't yet seen, we didn't on Monday see any neoclassic paintings, and we will today before the end of this lecture. And you will get that definition, which might come up on the final, remember. I think you'll agree by the end of this lecture that at least a couple of the images you see today are some of the most powerful types of topics or subjects that have ever been addressed in any movement or period of painting. And these will be two of them, will be paintings. We'll start with the first one of the two that I'm thinking of, that A, I'm not going to cut from the study list. I always tell you that when I get to each of those slides. And B, have a high probability of being the final. But more important is what their influence was for you in your notes to take, because it's rare for a painting to affect public policy in, governments or politics usually are separate from art, but not always. And you're going to see the influence of two of the greatest painters of their time today in the topic that we're covering, which is, of course, still romantic painting. Well, we have a lot to talk about, so let's get straight to, there we go. Welcome. All right, let's get to our first must-know image, because it's one of the two I was just saying, but I'll repeat that so you're all clear here. That this slide is very important. It has a very high possibility of being on the final. Well, we will not be cutting this one from the study list. Okay, so our first must-know today, and the title, or let's do the artist first, is Delacroix. Delacroix is how they say it in Indiana, Delacroix, if you're from New Jersey. But it's a French name, of course. I'll spell it slowly, D-E-L-A-C-R-O-I-X. Delacroix is how my French-speaking friends pronounce it, the artist's last name. The title, whoops, you guys are going to say, what am I not doing today? I didn't have my caffeine. They were out at the cafe. That's my excuse. I juxtaposed two of the slides, and so didn't get to the title yet. So let's just cross out Delacroix, or you leave it because we'll get to him later. You see, he's down the list. I meant to get to the next one at the top, one below the top there. Sorry, let's start over. I apologize. This work, and is the one I was thinking of, is so important. It won't cut it from the study list, but it's actually the artist's last name is Géricault, or Géricault, again, is how French speakers would say it, Géricault. G-E-R-I-C-A-U-L-T, Géricault. Raft, the title, Raft of the Medusa. M-E-D-U-S-A, has nothing to do with ancient god, Greek goddess, or Gorgon, they called her, evil goddess. Nothing to do with that. It's just the name of the ship that the raft came from. So again, the title is Raft of the Medusa, 1819. Now, there are so many things about this that make it a unique example. And one of the most famous, and this is how you get started, it's one of the most famous and influential, it was influential, of all romantic paintings. We'll see one of the others, the slave ship, a little later today. Okay, so what does this depict? An incident at sea, that should be obvious from the setting, in which a French passenger ship was caught in a storm, began to sink, and the captain and crew saved themselves and left the passengers to die. Really, I mean, that's a short way to say it. They didn't care. In other words, it's supposed to be, the other way around, right? That the captain is last to go down with the ship, or last to leave the ship in a storm, and the crew helps the passengers get safely off the boat. Just the opposite happened here on this ship called the Medusa. Of course, it was a French passenger ship. The captain and crew saved themselves and left the passengers to fend for themselves. And 75, that's what you're looking at, what's left of the original 75, out of hundreds of passengers on this ship, only 75 were able to get onto a raft. That's all they had, one raft to go to sea. It was pretty large. You could see that from this. If you look at the bottom part of the picture. But if you don't have to be, again, a math whiz, there's not 75 people on this raft. Why? Because most of them were dead by the time they were rescued. Only I'll say this slowly and repeat, it's a very powerful incident. It got the attention of the entire French population and the government of France. It was one of those cases where they were at sea for 9 days with no food and water. It's amazing that even that many, 15, if you do the math, that's 1 out of 5 survived, and the other 4/5, the other 80% died before they were rescued. You can see the dead bodies of some of them, and you don't have to, again, be, a ghoul to understand what was going on. When someone died, the other surviving passengers would eat them. I mean, it's, life or death. There was no other choice. They had no food and no water. That's the most amazing. Maybe there's a little bit of water that they took with them. So of course, if you drink seawater, you'll die if you keep drinking it. So it's amazing that this many people survive. And here's another interesting, not a minor detail. Here's another freed, probably originally from Africa, but he could have been born in France, a citizen of France. By this time, France had abolished slavery. They were one of the first countries in the world to do that. Not all at once, but they started freeing some of the colonial, slaves in the French Revolution. So this is after that. So here's a freedman, a Black French citizen. He was a citizen of France. We know who these people were. All of them became famous after this because they all survived long enough to go home and create a scandal. Obviously, this deserved to become a national scandal. Well, it was going to be anyway. This is the guy that saved them. You see what he's doing? He's signaling this ship way in the distance. If it hadn't been for him seeing, sharp-eyed as he was and standing up there to get that ship's attention, he probably all would have died. So when these people were rescued, here's the other part of the meaning. They went back to France and testified before the French Assembly. Of course, they called their government the Assembly, like Congress. And it was a national scandal because guess who owned that ship? A relative of the king. Yeah, they had a temporary king again after Napoleon was exiled. The rest of Europe put a new king back on the throne of France. And that wasn't the choice of the French people. They were forced to accept temporarily one more king. And he was corrupt. Obviously, he was corrupt. He did not have any or enough, I think it was no lifeboats on the deck of the Medusa. And he, that is the owner, was directly the blood relative of the king. Well, you can imagine the scandal that caused. They couldn't impeach a king, but they punished everyone involved in that decision, from the owner of the ship, even though he was a relative of the king, and he went to prison. The captain, he should have probably been tried for murder in essence. And then many members of the crew, if not all of them. These passengers who you could say survivors, a better word, they became famous and they went all over France talking about their experiences to audiences. And one of the groups that they spoke to was a painters association, or you can just say group of painters. And in that group was this artist, Géricault. So he asked them all to pose. All of the survivors, all 15 of them, posed for this painting. You can see then that this painting became one of the reasons, is the last fact now about the meaning, but it brings it right up to the present, or nearly to the present. The painting was so powerful, so influential, that when members of the French Assembly saw it, they were outraged, and a huge majority, to say almost all of their members of the French Assembly, again, capital A, voted to create a new law that all French ships, passenger ships going to sea, had to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. You might think that was self-evident or a given. Oh no, there were no rules about, laws at sea about passenger safety. They didn't care. But this is the first time that happened, at least in European history, because of this incident and this painting. That's a pretty powerful statement about the influence of art. Then the final thing, you don't have to write this, but you could parallel. Let's jump ahead. Okay, this is 1819. Anybody know of a similar disaster in 1912? I think some of you would. What was the famous ship that the world paid attention to and there were movies made about? Yeah, the Titanic, exactly. And that ship was British, and it didn't have enough lifeboats and was not against the law for that. back then. So the British took a century longer after the Titanic disaster. They passed the same kind of law, but nearly 100 years after the French government did. And so here we go, an example of a work of art influencing public policy or government, laws. And this now is, you don't have to write this, but if you ever get to Paris, of course, I would hope you'd want to make a beeline for the Louvre and maybe not just spend an afternoon. It's such a big museum, maybe 2 or 3 days. I would make this the room in which this painting has a whole wall to itself. I know a couple of you have probably seen it. It's powerful. It's basically a life-size image of what happened to these people. And it's of course the obvious fact about it being romantic. Look at the colors of the sky and the water. Those are, of course, bold, vivid, and somewhat unrealistic or exaggerated colors. Of course, it's dynamic.
I saw it.
Yeah, I was guessing you would have. Yeah, I stood in front of it for a long time, just looking at all the details. In fact, here's another African French citizen of African heritage. These were all free people. That's why when they testified before the French assembly, people really were riveted. They didn't have, of course, mass media, but in a way they did. Newspaper, you have to write in this. They had magazines and newspapers, of course, and people. It was like a long. Then there was a trial, of course, after the testimony before the government assembly. There was a trial in which those guilty parties were punished, as they well should have been. Okay, so let's switch to a formal analysis. I already start saying there isn't a straight line in it. I don't see anything stable. Everything is at a diagonal or curved line, all the way from the clouds to the waves on the ocean and the diagonal lines on the boards of the raft and all the human bodies. For space here, I think you could say there's atmospheric perspective, but it's minimal. It's just on that ship, but it's there, the ship that rescued them. And then we have, of course, it's got a vanishing point, scientific perspective, overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. All the main techniques for realistic space or depth are used here. The lines are all thin outlines. The modeling is very strong and realistic. The colors, like I said, are a bit exaggerated, but nonetheless, they're warm mixture, warm and cool, warm on all the skin tones. And the boat, or not boat, the raft, the boards on the raft, and even the sail is somewhat warm, but the sea around them is cool, and many of their clothing of the survivors, the white clothing, those are all cool. Of course, I don't know if you can say there's a single larger or smaller mass. I see this all as one mass, literally all the way up into the mast that they managed to create. They had to create that somehow before they started drifting at sea, but at least that way they could get, they thought they might find land, but they never did. The point is, it's really one large mass of human bodies. Is it balanced? Oh, very carefully. The African man here who's signaling to the ship, the rescue ship, is almost, with his shirt, is almost the same height as the top of the sail. And there's this, empty space in between. It forms a V, you can see that, of human bodies and objects. So it's roughly balanced left to right. And I would argue the sea and the sky both have, equal mass, or very nearly equal mass. So I think of it as roughly balanced. But if you see the sky is empty, of course, you could make the case that it's more unbalanced toward the bottom. Whoops, sorry, that does happen when I scan the scene. Okay, and then we have obviously the similar textures. Again, this is not always the case with romantic paintings. We saw on Monday, some of them had diffused modeling and even soft simulated textures, but these are all sharp and realistic. He wanted you to see the suffering of these people and the dead bodies that they had to eat to survive. So you would get the the powerful emotional component. Of course, that's the third thing, the third characteristic of all romantic paintings. You can guess what the emotion is if it's not obvious. Moral outrage against this corrupt policy and the king and his family, who directly caused this by not having enough, allowing a ship they own to go to sea with not enough lifeboats, or yeah, that's the right phrase, lifeboats. I mean, a raft isn't even usually meant for survivors to be on. Certainly not 75 of them. It's amazing that many got on it. Okay, let me see. Are we? Let's see. Color. I already covered.
Do you say that another emotion is
Yes. Go ahead.
Desperation.
Yeah, you could. Both that and hope. The hope is in the faces of the people closest to the front, where the African man, French African citizen is waving to the ship, and so you see their faces are full of hope. But you're right that the rest of them, yes, yeah, of course, they haven't seen it yet. Yeah. So yeah, you could say that. You could say that's actually three emotions. Moral outrage is the point of the viewer, from the point of the viewer. The goal of the painting and the painter is to make us feel moral outrage. But yes, it's true that within the painting you have a couple other emotions. Yes, desperation and hope, both. Well, okay, so you get an idea of why this painting was so powerful and so influential, and it's one of the most famous paintings of the Romantic movement. Okay, now we go to one that I actually took this slide. In fact, it didn't even make it into Stockstead for many editions. It wasn't in our slide library. I contributed this slide, I'm pleased to say, because when I saw this is a must know, I decided, well, it's such a unique image once you know the truth about it, that it's worthy of being on our syllabi. Of course, that's up to each instructor to decide which slide. So here we go. If you flip back, we're still on week 11, the previous page, it's at the bottom of week 11, that first paragraph. The artist's name is Villers, V-I-L-L-E-R-S, Villers, or Villiers, some people would say, but I don't think that's how it's pronounced correctly. V-I-L-L-E-R-S is the artist's last name. We'll say who she was in a minute. Now, this is the literal translation, young woman or girl, but that's it was listed at the museum where it's displayed in New York City. That's where I saw it, as girl, meaning young woman, you know, a teenager. She was a teenager. Girl at her easel, E-A-S-E-L, of course. Girl at her easel, 1802. In some editions, the title is slightly different because, of course, there are different interpretations. Obviously, it's French. If it's not obvious, I'm telling you now, it's French. And this is not romantic. This is not a romantic painting. It's a neoclassic painting, and we're going to say what that is right now. What is the definition of neoclassicism? Okay, here we go. Neoclassicism was a movement of European painting from the same period as Romanticism, from the late 17 to the late 1800s. Okay, which was a revival of ancient classical art, comma, which was a revival of ancient classical art, comma, more accurate and authentic than past revivals. More accurate and authentic than past revivals, period. What that tells us is these painters in the period we're talking about, late 17s, well into the mid to late 1800s, they were looking at ancient classical painting, sculpture, frescoes, architecture, whatever it was that inspired them, and trying to be more accurate in using the kinds of images that came from ancient classical art. Anybody need me to repeat that definition? Yeah, that, as I say, might appear on the true false section of the final. Okay, so how is this neoclassic? Well, let's start with the fact that the woman is wearing a Roman style dress. And if you know the history of that period, the fashion of that period, all over Europe, starting in France under Napoleon, he's the one that started this. He thought of himself as a modern day Roman emperor. Well, right there, that's a revival of ancient classical politics. But he and his empress, he and his wife, dressed like ancient Romans. And that's what the upper class and middle class, both middle and upper class families, if they could afford to. So she's dressed in an empire. That's the right word with a capital E.
Pierre.
Yeah, empire. Thank you. See, now your pronunciation is better than mine. Yeah, empire. Okay. Well, in English we'll say empire. It's the same word, of course. E, capital E, of course. M-P-I-R-E is a style of clothing, furniture, and even somewhat, arts and crafts. Furnishings in a room. if you've ever seen any of the paintings of that period, it's the same period as Jane Austen's novels. If you've ever seen any of the many movies made about her novels, the women are often dressed like this. This style comes from the neoclassic movement because
Jane Austen.
yeah, right. Is she in a way, of course, she's a romantic style writer, but her character's dressed in this neoclassic style. It's what Roman women wear. You can see it in their frescoes and in their sculptures. So there's one reason, the way this young woman is dressed. Another is the architecture across the river. This is in Paris. I'm going to say what the scene is in just a minute, but the last thing about what makes this a neoclassic painting. You see the building here? It's completely symmetrical. The proportions, everything about it is neoclassic, which would be what you'd see in the streets of Rome. I don't know if anybody knows, but the Romans, you don't have to write this. If you take Art 1.1, you'll know this because it'll cover it. They had multi-story apartment blocks. Yes, that far back with elevators. Yes, of course, they were run by slaves with pulleys, but they had supermarket. The Romans had a lot of stuff we think of as modern, including 5- and 6-story apartment buildings, and they would have looked like this building. They were probably mostly brick, but some of them were stone like this. So the building across the river, you could just say the view through the window is of a neoclassic style building. And then we have the fact that the overall scene is very sharp and realistic. That is a characteristic of all neoclassic paintings. They are not soft and diffused in their texture or their modeling. It's not part of the definition I just gave you, but it's a given. I've never seen a neoclassic style painting where at least the main objects, the people in the foreground or objects in the foreground, weren't sharp like they are here. Okay, so that's part of the meaning, what makes this neoclassic. But to me, much more interesting is who was the artist and who is this young woman? We know now who the artist is. She was one of the most successful female painters of her era, and she taught many women how to paint. She had her own studio, or that doesn't mean like just for herself. She had a whole school. You could even say that. We don't mean like, a bunch of buildings on a campus. We mean she had her own studio. The right word is studio, where she had dozens of students at any given time, just like you see in the studio art classes here on this campus, right? If you walk by any, or if you took any of them, you know what I mean. So this young woman, probably in her mid to late teens, is studying probably anatomy. And there's a reason why we think that she's looking at a nude model, because of this couple here, which I love this detail. Look at them. They're laughing. They're amused at what they see through the window, which has been wiped clean by probably this young woman or possibly her teacher. Denise was her first name, Denise Villers. She was really ahead of her time. Not only was she one of the few successful, independent, totally with no male, partner that she depended on, independent female painters in Europe, not just France at that time, one of the few. But she was the most successful and influential because she taught another generation or even two generations of women how to paint and draw. I don't know if she taught sculpture, but she was a great painter. We now know that, here's the last part of the meaning, because this painting for decades was displayed in the Museum of the Met, the Met, the biggest art museum in New York City, as a work by David, a man. We haven't covered him yet. I probably should, but there's an order to why these slides are lined up. So we'll cover him next. David was the top French painter, period. And he was a neoclassic painter. We'll see his work in the next couple of must-knows. He was the most famous. So the museum curators, the only one word for that is sexism. Of course, they assumed that this brilliant work of art, I mean, it's hypnotic. It's when you stand in front of this painting, I defy anybody not to look deeply into the intelligent, intense expression of this serious student. And you just know she's going to be successful at what she does because she's being taught by a great teacher, a female who was a role model to her, of course. And so the point is that this was a case of mistaken identity. This painting was displayed as either by David or a student of David. That's, you see him on the list down there, right? That's his last name, David. just because they couldn't believe a woman did it, they didn't do their research. Finally, I don't know who, but somebody, probably one of the staff at the Met, said, wait a minute, let's check on this painting and the background. And they found out it was by a woman named Villiers. And now she has books written about it. There have been documentaries. I'm talking about the artist. This student, it turns out, has been identified as a young woman who was one of her star pupils. Well, you could sort of tell that because she's the subject of a painting by a very successful female artist. I think that's fascinating to know. And then to see that it took well over a century to get the facts right, of course, because of the sexist attitude of the previous group of curators at the Met, which is true of a lot of museums. I'm not picking on the Met per se. A lot of them would have made that false assumption. Okay, and then this little vignette, the French, you know, some of you know how to spell that word. If you don't, you can just say slice of life. That's the English translation. A scene in which some humor is being displayed here, because these people are not even noticing the students in the room. They're looking right through the window past all of these students, you know, in their easels to the nude model, and of course finding that amusing. So it's a little touch of humor that is a brilliant little extra added part of the meaning. This artist, Villiers, Denise Villiers, was very, very skilled at doing these little details, as well as the sharp, realistic portrayal of her students and, of course, other people. She was commissioned to do portraits all over France. Okay, so that's the meaning. We already said the simulated texture is obviously superb. What I like about it is the modeling, the way the light shines across, you know, the edges of her arm and around her head here, and just on the edges of her chin, her cheek, and her robe, or her dress. It's actually a dress. It's brilliant. The modeling is very sharp and realistic and very powerful. It evokes, you know, the attention of a viewer. Every viewer I've talked to, I've gone to this museum a couple of times with friends who didn't know about this woman, this artist, and they always find this painting fascinating. Okay, and then we have the colors. Well, her dress is cool, but obviously skin tones, and there is some kind of a, looks like a cloth, maybe a curtain, probably is a curtain, thrown over the back of the chair. That's warm, as is the inside of the room, the walls. But then again, the building across the river is cool. So they're both, all the lines are thin. This is brilliantly balanced. I mean, look at the way the window space and the space between the top of the chair and the floor here, that area covered by where she's, you know, basically the seat she occupies is almost identical. It's that triangular arrangement of space, you know, which has a diagonal aspect to it. And then this empty area here is roughly balanced by the one behind her head. So it's very carefully balanced left to right and top to bottom, but not in an obvious symmetrical way. She's obviously the largest mass, and then I guess you could say the window, and then yeah, it's a close call. Maybe the chair would be third largest. And then we have stable or dynamic. I see it as mostly stable, although there's a diagonal line, obviously, to her easel. Her body is pretty much at a right angle, except for the very upper part, but even her head and neck and everything out the window is, the building, the framing, the chair. So it's mostly stable. And the rhythm is obvious with repeated body parts and objects across the river. But then finally, we have no altered or distorted proportion or scale here. These people are in, oh yeah, space. I forgot to mention it. It should be obvious by now. You guys have done this on your own papers, but there is foreshortening, of course. There's diminishing size of the people, of course, in the background. There would have been definitely a vanishing point, scientific perspective. There's no atmospheric perspective. So there's overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, and scientific perspective. Okay. This is a very important painting. I'm not cutting it from the study list because of the artist and the subject matter. I said we'd talk about this guy right afterwards. So here we go. This is David, or David, is the way we'd say in English, but it's pronounced. Every time I've heard people in Paris pronounce his name, because this painting is in the Met in New York, but many, many more of his paintings are in the Louvre because he was French. David is how you pronounce his last name, D-A-V-I-D, of course. The title, Death of Socrates. And you might already know how to spell his name, but I'll spell that, S-O-C-R-A-T-E-S, Socrates, 1787. Well, let's start out with who David was. I already said, but I didn't ask you to write it. Now you definitely do. He was the most famous and successful of all French painters during his lifetime, period. Not just as a neoclassic painter. There's no question it's not romantic. This is neoclassic. And we'll say why in a minute. So again, I'll repeat that. Who was David? He was the most famous and successful of all French painters during his lifetime. Nobody would argue with that. Okay, I mean, even more famous than Guercino, even though they lived at the same time, because of his subject matter and the fact that he was the greatest neoclassic painter in Europe. Again, nobody argues with that. It's just in France. I'll say it again. Also, besides being the most successful painter, a French painter of any style, he also was the most famous neoclassic painter in all of Europe. And the reasons become clear when you look at a painting like this. This depicts a scene from ancient Greece. Of course, everyone knows, right? Socrates is one of the first great Greek philosophers. He's the one that was, question authority, the bumper sticker. You see a lot of it, Berkeley, where other, anyway, that concept, that phrase, he's the guy that first, in essence, said to do that. And so what this depicts is the day he took poison to end his own life, because he had only one other choice: public execution. Why? Because the government of Athens tried him for treason for criticizing them. So he was willing to die for free speech, for the freedom of speech and thought. And that's what he's doing. You see, he's pointing upward, saying the truth or freedom is worth dying for. It's a pretty powerful message, pretty strong. And it's indicated here by him willing to take his own life so that he dies with his, dignity, that he isn't executed in a public place. So, sorry. Somebody had a
Excuse
question?
me.
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah.
I don't see this in the book.
Well, if it isn't, it's a failure of Stockstead. Yeah, I did say not every slide that you're going to see.
Oh, so
yeah,
this is not in the book.
Yeah, you're right. But
Okay.
it's such an important, no, it's good to clarify that. But you can, we'll have no trouble. You can find it on any decent website that covers this artist. You just Google David and this image will come up.
Okay.
So yeah, it's good to know that. All right, so let's now say what we see is his followers, his disciples. It's a little bit like Christ at the end of his life when he accepted calmly being arrested and tried for treason and executed. Of course, that's what happened to Jesus, right? And so this is no accident that there's a similar kind of feeling in this painting as it would have been when Jesus said goodbye to his followers at the Last Supper, which we've already covered. How many different paintings were there? But this is the first painting to use all the accurate details. I mean, down to the togas that they're wearing. Some people think only Romans wore togas. No, the Greeks were the first to have those. The oil lamps, the stone building, the prison, he's in prison behind him here, even the bed he's on, everything about it, including we know what he looked like because he was so famous during his lifetime that portraits were made of him, coins were cast, sculptures were done of his head and bust of him. So we know basically what he looked like. So this is, again, an accurate, right, revival of ancient classical art, specifically of a scene from ancient Greece, which is the night that Socrates decided to take his own life instead of being publicly humiliated by public execution the next day. His followers are begging him not to do it, but he had a good reason to do it. So he's literally, the message here, the powerful message is that Socrates was willing to risk his life for truth and freedom. And then the other half of the message, powerful. Remember, emotional messages are part of both Romanticism and Neoclassicism. Some neoclassic paintings, not all, but most have a moral lesson. So the lesson here is not just what happened to Socrates, but guess what was about to happen to France? If you know your history, I'm sure a couple of you do. 1787, what happened 2 years later in France? Pretty important event, but still influential.
The revolution?
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Yes, the French Revolution was just, you could say, around the corner or about to happen in your notes, however you want to write there, within 2 years. And that's what all famous, I'm sorry, I don't mean famous, all well-educated people, not just painters, but writers, artists of all kinds, intellectuals. You can just say the educated people of France knew a revolution was inevitable. It was such a corrupt society. If you ever read The Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, that'll get the point across. It was a horribly oppressive society with nobody having any rights except the king and the upper classes. So just say it this way: the French Revolution was almost about to happen, and David knew that. So he's making a statement. Oh, again, last part of the meeting here, which is, if this man, this famous philosopher Socrates, you just say Socrates is willing to risk his life for truth and freedom, we should be prepared to do the same, which is, of course, what led to the revolution, the French Revolution, 2 years later. Okay, that's the whole meaning. We already said the formal analysis is going to include all neoclassic paintings are this way. No soft or diffused modeling or textures everywhere. All the textures, the modeling is just sharp and realistic on the skin, the clothing, the stone wall behind them, everything. It is almost entirely stable. Look carefully. The only things dynamic are the archways here, right? It's one, actually, it's a single archway. Even the figures that are mourning are mostly sitting or standing upright. I mean, this one guy is leaning over. Socrates is at almost a right angle with his legs, pretty close. He's pointing upward. It's primarily a stable painting. The largest mass would be the wall behind them, and then you decide, is it this group of his followers who are weeping next to him? If that's one mass, if you see it that way, that'd be the second largest. Otherwise, it would be Socrates if you break them down individually. And then maybe one of these two at the foot of his bed here, because you see more of their bodies than the others. They seem to be taller, so they could be the third largest mass. After Socrates would be the second largest. All the lines are thin. The colors, of course, are cool on the wall behind them, and the white colored robes of some Socrates and one or two others, blue and white. And then warm, of course, robes or togas, whichever word you want to use, and skin tones on all of the people are the warm colors. Then we have the rhythm, of course, all the body parts, the human body parts, and the walls, the stones in the prison walls. It's balanced roughly left to right. I would consider this archway and these people here roughly balancing out, if you take it from right about the middle, this group here, and he's right almost dead in the center of it, very close to the center. So it's roughly balanced left to right, but obviously unbalanced toward the bottom. The proportion and scale, all of it is realistic. Nothing's been altered. Then we have for space, overlapping, of course, foreshortening, right? Diminishing size. And there is no question it had scientific perspective, but there's no atmospheric perspective. Okay, let's move on now. Oh yeah, that's right. This is at the end of this. So what I'm going to do is go back, hang on, to one other. Well, let's wait. We'll see, depending on how much time we have. I might just cut one slide. But what I want to do right now is stop the share. Okay. And I'll have to go to another file here. I always forget which one of these arrows. And we haven't finished. We've still got actually at least as many slides as we've always. Yeah, this loves doing this. I can never quite. Okay, it keeps disappearing. It does that. I don't know why. Okay, let's see. Maybe we'll just go to this screen. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we are going to look at a couple of more important images, one of which is maybe the most important slide of today's lecture, the slave ship. Probably end with that one. Okay, so should be chapter 29. And yes, it is. Here we go. The next must know should be the death of Marat. Let's see where he put that. There it is. There it is. Also by David, so you'll see why I'm doing it in this order. Again, as Tanya, you pointed out, not all the slides are in Stockton, about 90+%, but a few of them aren't. But these two, the one we just saw, the Death of Socrates, and this one, the next must know, are both very important. I might cut one of them, but for now, just assume they both have an equal chance of being on the final. So this is our next must know. Again, it's just below Death of Socrates, the same artist, David. Death of Marat, and that's M-A-R-A-T, 1793. Well, now, if you see that 6 years later by the same artist, what a difference a decade or a different decade makes. What's going on here? Well, some of you may know this story, and if not, I'll tell you what happened, but it's, enough of a detail, a
Mr.
complicated.
Wilson, we cannot see the picture.
Uh-oh, that is where I always, thank you very much, because I didn't hit. Come on, screen sharing. See, it says screen sharing. That's what throws me off. But you have to do a double take on this. So thank you. I apologize. All right. Now let's see. It should be possible to see this. It says
Yep,
you
you can see it.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. Right. Thanks. Please always speak up if that happens. I'm going to try to remember not to assume that you can see it without asking. I usually do ask. Okay. So what do we have here? We have, again, the death of Marat. I'll spell that man's name, M-A-R-A-T. Now, it's the same painter, but now the French Revolution is in full force. The French Revolution had happened already several years earlier, and the painter David was a supporter of this man. Who was he? A monster. There's no other word for this kind of person. Marat. You see his name is down there, and there's, if it's on the exam, you shouldn't have a problem noticing that's the title, Death of, and then there's the artist last name. So who was Marat? He was one of the three rulers of France during the Reign of Terror. Please spell that R-E-I-G-N, not R-A-I-N. The Reign of Terror was a horrible period in which hundreds of thousands of innocent French civilians, 50,000 in Paris alone, were beheaded over about a 2-year period at the orders of people like Marat. They were the leaders of the French Revolution. You could say they hijacked it, whatever you want to say. They took it over. They became the government. They were called themselves the Committee of Public Safety. It was exactly the opposite. In other words, anyone could accuse anyone else in the whole country of France. Any one citizen could get someone executed if they wanted their apartment, they wanted their wife or their husband, they wanted the money, their business. They'd say, he spoke out against the revolution, and instantly it was like ultimate cancel culture. Much worse though, because these people were killed. You didn't have any rights. If you were accused of treason, Marat would be one of the three people that would sign your death warrant, and you had no chance. It didn't matter. They gave you a 10-minute show trial in which you were already found guilty, just like what happens in, many dictatorships that we've seen, like, Iran and Russia under Putin. I mean, they didn't have to answer to anybody because they weren't elected, and there was no democracy at this point, even though the revolution was about trying to create a democracy. It took them a while to get that in France. They did. Of course, they have one now. So what you see here is that one of the three dictators who ran France with all the power to order anyone's execution, and he was personally responsible for the death of thousands of innocent people. So how did he die? That's the other half of the meaning. The sister of one of his victims, a heroine if there ever was one, disguised herself as a man because she knew he wouldn't see her if she came as, herself as a female, because these guys were also sexist as well as, bloodthirsty, the ones that ran the Reign of Terror. And so what happened is she disguised herself as a man and made up a phony list. That's what he's got in his hand as he's now lying dead in his own bathtub, by the way, if you're curious. That's where he is, in his own apartment in Paris. She knocked on the door and said she had a list of traitors. So he, of course, was ecstatic that he could get more people on a list of people to execute. So he was willing to let her come into his apartment, and while he was reading this phony list, she snuck into his bathroom, had a knife hidden in her clothing, and stabbed him to death. He bled to death. You see the blood in his own bath. She was tried and executed, of course, but her act of courage to try and end the Reign of Terror helped to break the back of that group, that government that ran the Reign of Terror. After that, people began to protest and say, this is wrong. We need to stand up to these people, like you see what's happening in Iran now. Don't know if they'll succeed. But anyway, so it did eventually lead to the overthrow of the other two people, but she is the one who started that trend. And her name was Charlotte Cordroy. I didn't used to know it. One of my students wrote an extra credit paper on her. Cordroy, Cordray, a heroine if there ever was, willing to risk her life to help end this horrible period of mass executions. And her actions were, she's got monuments to her in some whatever town in France she came from. She wasn't from Paris. Pretty important moment. But what's Marat's message? I'm sorry, I meant David. David's message here is we should mourn the loss of this great patriot and revolutionary leader. He had, in other words, done however you want to say it, he had been seduced, corrupted, fooled by these people into thinking that they were only protecting the revolution. They weren't. They were just power hungry and of course bloodthirsty, these three men, including Marat. So when Marat died, he knew Marat. He came to the scene and saw him in his bath, his dead body, when the other rulers of the revolutionary government were trying to figure out who did it, right? So they had an investigation, and he, as the painter, was invited to do this painting at the death, you can't say deathbed, the death bath, the death scene, I guess is the right word, of Marat. So it's exactly what his body looked like when it was found the next day. And the painter, David, saw it this way. But he's trying, the bottom line here is his goal, the painter, is to make this man out to be a martyr, a victim of some crazy woman. Never mind that the real villain here was Marat, of course. That's a powerful message, but it's one that most people didn't fall for. They understood who the real villains were, the three men that ran the Reign of Terror, and who the real hero was. But that's not how David saw it. Okay, so that's the whole meaning. At neoclassic, absolutely, there is nothing soft and diffused about the modeling or semi texture. What makes it slightly like an ancient sculpture is there's a famous Roman sculpture that was in Paris, in the Louvre, that most people who ever had been to the Louvre had seen. It's of a dying Roman soldier. And his body is in this position. Of course, a Roman soldier would have armor on, but it's in the same position. And this soldier was supposed to be a hero who gave his life to, prevent some invading army from getting into Rome before they could defend the city. You don't have to know the details. You can just say this is pose of this painting of Marat in this painting is based on the position of a famous sculpture of a hero, a Roman soldier who helped defend the city against an invasion, which is how he sees, the painter sees Marat, as a hero of the revolution. So he's trying to convey that. And we see the sharp realism everywhere you look, except for the background. That is a bit unusual, right? It's probably, could be wallpaper, otherwise it could be just some nondescript patterns, but the details are what we care about. The bottom half are all super. So we'll do the formal analysis. Super sharp and realistic on all of the textures and the modeling, of course, on the wooden box, on even the piece of paper, and his body, of course, the robes or sheets. I guess they are sheets. He had a bad skin disease, by the way, very, very painful. So he had to spend most of his waking hours in a bath, which was his death place. And then we have it's stable. I mean, there's hardly anything dynamic about it. If you look at the position of his body, slightly, of course, the top of his head, the bottom of one arm, but most everything is at a right angle. Mostly stable. The largest mass would be the bath, then him, his upper body, and then the wooden box. And for this, for space, there's three techniques. Overlapping, you would have to say diminishing size somewhat on the two arms a little bit, right? The farther away, and of course foreshortening, overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. No other space techniques here. There's no distorted proportion or scale here, of course. And let's see, the rhythm obviously is, everything has rhythm. His body, of course, the lettering on the box, the fake list of names, even, the lettering creates rhythm. Okay. Yeah, and the colors, his skin tone, of course, is warm, as is the wooden box. The sheets over his bath tub are cool. All right. So let's keep going now. We've already done the 3rd of May, 1808. Don't forget, if you weren't there on Monday, if you didn't see that lecture, you want to watch that. I've actually already posted that lecture for those who missed the Monday lecture. And I've already done the lecture of the first half of next week's lecture, because I won't be, remember, don't try to log in on Monday. I will be on my way back from LA and nowhere near a laptop. But I recorded it, and the first half of this list of slides for next week, which is the topic realism and impressionism, including the definitions. You definitely want to watch that. It'll be posted by Friday along with both lectures from this week. Okay, by 8 p.m. or sooner. Okay, we're going to go forward now. Let's see. Did I decide to cut this? I think I did. Yeah, I did. Okay, let's keep going. These are all romantic things. Here we go. Here's the next must know. Constable, C-O-N-S-T-A-B-L-E, the Haywain. The Haywain is one word. That means a wagon, a wagon for hay. It's the English word. It's one word, Haywain. 1821. If you've ever been to the National Gallery in London, you've probably seen this painting. It has a prominent place on the wall of a room full of paintings by who was Constable. That's usually how we start the meaning. He was the most successful British landscape painter of his era, period. I'll say it again. He was the most successful British landscape painter of his lifetime or his era, ERA. No one would argue with that. And he was also the most popular British, one of the most popular British romantic painters. Clearly he was romantic. We'll see that as we go through. Well, let's start with what makes it romantic. Well, I think you can see it's got diffused simulated textures, and you've got a very powerful and dramatic scene of a storm coming in over this meadow here. And this farmer and it might be his son, looks like it to me, or maybe it's, it looks like the father and son trying to get back to the house. And it's not going to be this house. I don't think it's their house. Otherwise, they'd be going this way, right? So they've got some distance to get home before the storm breaks. So there is an emotional component here, but it's not what you'd think it would be. It's not fear of being caught in a storm. That's not it. So just say the dramatic quality of the composition that marks this as romantic is evident in the storm, in the sky, and the way the trees, are dynamic, right? And the riverbank. I mean, it's more dynamic than stable, though it has some stable elements in the horizon and the house. But even there, the roof lines are dynamic. So it's a dynamic and massive composition, and then it also has slightly exaggerated colors. Not too much, but a little bit in the way the sky is depicted in the clouds. He's emphasizing that, but even somewhat on the meadow where the sunlight is dappled, you could say, or sections of the sun light is peeking through the clouds, lights up some of the landscape, some of the grass or meadow, and others are in shadow. That's one of his signature motifs. Alternating areas. I'll say this again slowly. One of this artist, Constable's main, they're called signature motifs. Now, I think I've used that word before, but you'll hear me use it more so as we go through the last part of the semester. When an artist creates techniques that are their own and then uses them in most, if not all, of their paintings, specifically with painting, you call that a signature motif. So his signature motifs were three things. First, the alternating areas of light and dark in the background of his paintings. So it draws your eye all the way into the horizon. Another was exaggerated clouds in the sky, which you get some hint of that from what I said before about the dramatic quality of the composition. But that also he was a superb painter of cloudscapes, two words, cloudscapes. Not all painters were that concerned with the sky or clouds. He was. But his most important element that marks him as the most influential and popular of all English, well, British means by extension, right? Great Britain, all British landscape painters is the message, the emotional component, a love for the beauty of the English landscape. If you've ever taken a train, a bus, or a car ride, let alone hiked in the English countryside where it's unspoiled, because parts of England still are that way, you'd understand why he felt such powerful attachment to the beauty of the countryside of the country he was born in. He was arguing for preserving it when nobody else cared about that, right? I mean, preservation of the environment, that wasn't even a concept. He was one of the first, and you would say, kind of a quasi-environmentalist. I would not say that's too strong a word to use in your notes, because he was trying to convey the beauty of the natural landscape and how that, therefore, if we can appreciate it, we should preserve it or protect it from too much development, because this was the era of the Industrial Revolution. That's the last part of the meeting. This is the period against the background of this period when he was painting, that there was all kinds of expanding of big cities, not just London, but all larger British cities were expanding rapidly into the countryside, eating up the landscape. And there were factories, right? And railroad lines and coal mines and all kinds of, industrial is the word, developments that were destroying the beauty of parts of the English countryside. And he was against that. He was arguing we should, be careful and not destroy the beauty of the landscape of our own country. And that's what shows in his paintings, is this message and that emotional attachment, love of the beauty of nature in the English countryside. Okay, so the whole meaning, and then we're going to do the slave ship is going to be our last one. I think we might cut one or two, but let's wrap this up with a formal analysis. Well, I've hinted at this, but I guess you should be writing. There's soft and diffuse simulated texture and modeling. You notice it on the house here. It's not super sharp. And the trees even. It's a little more realistic, ironically, on the wagon itself, because that's the focus almost in the lower center of the painting, because it focuses you on these two men trying to get home before the storm. And then somewhat realistic, it's even more sharp and realistic than diffused on the trees in the forest in the background. But everything else, the sky, the meadow, the river, the house, it's mostly soft and diffuse simulated textures and modeling. It is balanced, or is it? If you count the clouds as mass, remember, they're not just empty sky or gas. They are liquid floating in the air, of course. I would consider that mass, and to me, it balances because of that, left to right, and top to bottom, with the top row of clouds, the darkest section where the storm is forming, roughly equal to the area of the shoreline. I see it as balanced both ways, but if you see it as more empty, because there is a little bit of empty sky here to the right, then of course you could make the case that it's unbalanced toward the left, but definitely balanced roughly towards, top to bottom. The rhythm is obvious with the tree branches, the roof lines of the house, the trees everywhere you look, and even the wagon. There's lots of rhythm. It's both stable, dynamic, but in this case, it's more dynamic, I would say, because of the tree branches, the roof lines, or the peak gables are called. The clouds are all dynamic. The most stable part is the meadow and the forest in the background. But the river and the wagon, that's all dynamic. So it's mostly dynamic. The lines are thin. What lines there are outlined? There's no distorted proportions or scale. And then there would be alternating warm colors on the shoreline and the house, the roof lines anyway. Well, the walls are cool. The trees are green, so that would mostly be considered cool, except when you look further back into the meadow with the way the sun's hitting it, I consider that warm green on at least on the grasses. And then the sky is almost entirely cool, as is the river. So it's more cool than warm, but there are several warm areas. Okay, and I think I've already mentioned the rhythm, right? The repeated shapes of the trees and the wagon and the roof lines of the house. Okay, now we're going to get to a painting that is so...
What about space?
Pardon? Oh, yeah, you're right.
Space.
No, you're right. I do need sometimes, thank you. As always, I welcome that to reminders. Yes, here we have all the main techniques. We have diminishing size, of course, as you get further back into the forest. There's no question there's a vanishing point here. And this has atmospheric perspective. He was a master at that. Yeah, look at that. That's a village in the distance there. Another town somewhere, maybe 10 miles away. So it's got atmospheric perspective and a vanishing point, scientific perspective. Obviously, it has overlapping, and then it has diminishing size, of course, on the trees, right? And foreshortening on the landscape and the house. So it's got all the main techniques that are associated with realistic depiction of depth of space. Okay, the painting we're going to end with is, if I had to pick one for the most important painting, maybe for this whole week, but certainly for today's lecture, this would be it. If you ever see this painting in person, if it doesn't make you emotionally moved, then you're not looking closely or even outraged. It's supposed to. It's The Slave Ship by Turner. I don't think I have to spell either of those, right? Turner is, of course, common last name. Turner, the artist, The Slave Ship, 1839. Let's start with who was Turner. Turner was the most famous British painter, period, regardless of what genre, topic, the most famous British painter. He came slightly after Constable, but he was even more famous than Constable. They lived within a few decades, or they overlapped their lifespan. So just say during his lifetime, that's the way to keep it brief. Turner was by far the most famous British painter. Why? For two reasons. He experimented with some of the compositional techniques. We'll talk about that when we do the formal elements. He experimented with some new compositional techniques that were ahead of their time, very much so, decades ahead of their time. And even more important, his choice of subjects were powerful with emotional components. Very powerful emotional reactions were what his paintings evoke, if you know what you're looking at here. So here's another fact about him. I mean, it's hard to overstate his importance. He was a very passionate abolitionist way back as a young man. He was that way when the British Empire had slavery in all their colonies, and within the British Isles there was slavery. He grew up in the late 1700s. He hated slavery. He was also from the lowest class. That is an interesting part of his reason for why he was so passionate about getting rid of social injustice. Not just slavery, but that was the worst, of course, of all the injustices. So he was a Cockney. That's not a minor fact. A Cockney, if you know anything about Britain, is the lowest of the low classes. It's the lowest rung of working class. Even now, there's a part of the British society that is Cockney. Michael Caine, the actor who's won, 3 Academy Awards? He's from that part of London. It's the poorest neighborhood in London. Poor white folks, one of my British friends called it, living in slums. And they've kind of fixed it up a bit now because of all the money and tourism in London. But just say it this way, he came from the poorest neighborhood of London, and he never gave up his Cockney accent. If you've never heard a Cockney accent, watch a movie with Michael Caine and you'll see what I mean. But he had a very thick accent, and he never took on airs, never took on airs. He became the most successful, famous, and popular of all painters, as I just said, in the British Isles. He could have just acted like, God's gift to the art world. He never had an attitude. In other words, when I say airs, like, you know what I mean? He dressed the same working class way he had as a young man. He never tried to show off, in other words, which to me is a very, very good characteristic. Quite a few people get, pretentious, right? Full of themselves when they become famous. He didn't. And so this painting, the most important painting of his career, most people would agree, was his statement against slavery, and that the British government, that's Parliament, you know about that word, right? Because it's in the news a lot lately. The British Parliament was debating whether to end slavery completely. They had ended it in the British Isles, but not in all their colonies. In the 1830s, they spent years debating it. And he decided to illustrate the evils of slavery with this painting of a true incident. So now this is the other half of the meeting. What does it depict or display? It's a true incident that occurred in the previous century, you can just say in the 1700s, of a British slave ship that was caught in a storm at sea. And you can see that that's what this is right here. A British slave ship was caught in a storm at sea. And the captain, knowing that if his slaves were delivered either ill or injured because the ship was being tossed around and the slaves were, obviously not able to protect themselves. If he delivered them either ill or injured, he wouldn't get paid, or get paid a lot less. However, if this isn't sickening, I don't know what is. The law at the time and the insurance company policy was if they died at sea, he got full payment for them when he got to the port. He would just report them as dead. So he threw 133 of those slaves in their chains overboard to die. They would either drown or be eaten by flesh-eating fish. And you see some of both things happening here. A horrific incident. Even at that time, that far back, it was considered a crime. So he didn't get maybe punished, but he had some kind of sanctions when he returned back to England. But the point is, it wasn't enough of a clear message that slavery could have ended 60 years earlier if they had voted. They didn't then, the British Parliament. They waited until the 1830s, although they had debated it before. And this is the final point of the meaning of this painting. This artist, I just told you how powerful and strong a voice he was for abolition. He decided to illustrate this scene to depict that God is, he actually was quoted at one point, pretty close, you say a paraphrase of his reason for painting it. God is angry with us because obviously it's a crime against humanity. And he's saying it's way past time to end it. So how did this influence Parliament? There's no proof. Just say many historians, last part of the meeting, believe that this painting, which was on display for years, it took him, it was such a powerful subject, it was emotional for him to try and finish the painting. So he didn't do it all in, a few months like some painters. He spent years working on it. So while he was working on it in his studio, he's such a famous painter, members of Parliament came to see it, those who were thinking of voting to end slavery. And if they weren't convinced already when they saw this painting, it probably, we can't prove that, but just say it's likely it influenced several members of Parliament to vote finally to end slavery in the British Isles, which, by the way, they did in the 1830s, 30 years before, almost 30 years before the United States. And this painting at least had a likely role in that. Again, it's rare to see a single work of art influencing public policy, but this one clearly did. And then the final thing is, it's not in Britain. No one would buy it. The subject was too upsetting or too controversial. Plus, it was criticized as being a bad painting, which is ridiculous. It's a masterpiece. So what happened? An American abolitionist, a close friend of Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, that's the last part of the meeting, bought it to bring it to the United States to help try and convince our government, and it took another 30 years and a civil war finally to end slavery. He displayed it in his home, and when he died, it was willed to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. That's where it is. You can go see it today. It's one of their most prized paintings. It's on the wall. It has a wall to itself. Very powerful painting. So it's not in the British Isles because no one there would buy it, but an American abolitionist, one of the first American abolitionists, he was writing newspaper articles about ending and magazines about ending slavery back in the 1820s, that far back. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. You don't have to use his name, but you should say an American abolitionist bought it and brought it to the United States to help convince our government to do the same as the British. All right, final analysis here of formal elements, and we'll end right about on time. So we're going to cross out a couple, but let's do that after we finish the formal elements here. This has diffuse modeling and textures everywhere. But the closest thing to anything sharp texture and modeling would be one of the legs of a deceased or dying slave that's closest to us. But almost everywhere you look, you can see there's no sharp outlines. In fact, even the mast of the boat, at first glance, you might say, well, aren't those strong and sharp lines? No, look carefully. They are fairly diffused. Obviously, the sky, the sun, it's the sunset. The sun is setting in this scene. The waves of the ocean, most of the body parts of the slaves that were thrown overboard are all soft and diffuse modeling and simulated textures. It's so dynamic, it's obvious. There's not a straight line in it. Nothing. There's no straight lines. Everything is either diagonal or curved. Then we have for color, warm in the sky, the blood red sky, which he was saying that the reason he painted that color was that point he made about God being angry with us for this kind of crime. And then we see there's some warm, of course, the hands and arms and legs of some of the slaves in the water. All human skin tones, as always, are warm, but the water itself is a mixture of warm and cool. Some of the sky is. And then we have, there's no lines, there's outline, none. So he was ahead of his time. That's something that when you see the lecture I just completed, it'll be posted Friday on the first half of Impressionism, you'll only know by the definition why that's a basic element of all Impressionist paintings. There are no lines, none in Impressionist painting. Here he is 30 years before that movement, painting a scene with not a single line as outline. There are no actual lines per se in this painting. That's a radical departure. Is there a scientific perspective? It's hard to see. I mean, is there a vanishing point? Well, where's the horizon? We're not supposed to be concerned about that in this painting. That's why it was criticized. So, but there is obviously diminishing size, overlapping, foreshortening to some degree on the water and the waves. And I think you could say atmospheric perspective on the storm here. But as far as a vanishing point, it's hard to say. I don't know to say. It appears that it could have, but there's no obvious hint of any vanishing point. The rhythm is obvious: the waves, the clouds in the sky, the masts of the ship, the drowning slaves. And then we have balance. I'd say so, because the area of the sky and the water are roughly equal. When you add the waves crashing up here on this side, it's roughly equal. I would say top to bottom. Left to right, it depends on how you view it. This area, of course, where he added the blood red color in the sky, it's no more mass or less mass than the white part of the sky. So I would say it's balanced left to right, but the ship mass for some people would make them feel that it's slightly or somewhat unbalanced toward the left. Okay, and then we have, let's see, the largest mass, I guess the sky, then the ocean, and then the ship in the distance. And there's no distortion of proportion that we can clearly identify here. He might have exaggerated the shackle leg of this one dying slave here, maybe slightly, that you could say that. But otherwise, all of the human body in the water and the ship in the distance are pretty much the same proportions, or scale that to each other, I should say, scale to each other. And there's no distorted proportion because there's no intact, complete human body visible. Okay, let's see, line, modeling, texture, rhythm. I think we covered that all, and it is 4:15. So let's stop the share and I'll take questions if you have any. Okay. I can tell you right now that painting is very likely, I'm not saying it absolutely will, but very likely to appear on one or the other section of the final.
So that wasn't part of the book.
That is in the book. Unless
Page.
yeah. Pardon?
The page, I couldn't find it.
Oh, the slave ship is in. I was just looking at it last night. It's in stock there.
Oh, I saw that, the one you just showed.
That's
Slave
the
ship?
slave ship. That's in stock.
Huh.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one thing that it would be almost, what can I say? It's not a crime, but it would be a ridiculous oversight not to include that painting in any book that covers Turner as an artist, even if it's only, I think they only have 3 of his paintings. Unless you have an edition that's an exception, because I've had 3 editions of Stockstead I have at home over the years. They used to give us those.
Volume 2.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be volume 2. Yeah, I just saw it in my edition at home. But in any case, again, it is the most famous painting by one of the most famous painters of the 19th century. So you could easily find it in so many websites. There's a movie, by the way, which you can get 10 points. Remember, options for extra credit include watching a film of an hour or more. I think it is a full 2 hours, called Turner, just his last name. And it does indicate how powerful a voice he was for social justice through his work and his attitude about the rich establishment and the mainstream artists who ridiculed him, even though his work was a success during his lifetime. He was popular, but he wasn't looking for money or fame per se. He was trying to address these issues. I mean, I think in one edition of Stockstead, the largest print is of the burning of the Houses of Parliament, which is an important painting too, but not as influential as the slave ship. That's his most famous painting. At least in all the editions I've seen, I have, like I said, 3 of them that were, every year they put a new edition out. So maybe some foolish person took that out of a later edition, but I'd be surprised if they did. That's stupid. It's a pretty important painting. If you're going to talk about Turner, you almost have to talk about that painting. But it isn't any good website. Or you know what? There's another couple of books you could look in: Gardner's History of Art or Jansen's. I've mentioned them at the beginning of the semester. Those are not required. You don't have to even look at them to get an A in the class, but you could look there if you have access in the library, whatever library you can go to. Jansen, Janson, and Gardner, Gardner. Those both, again, I have those editions at home, at least fairly recent ones, maybe 3 or 4 years old pre-pandemic. Both of them have in their chapter on romantic painting, they have this selection. Okay, any questions about anything we've covered? And don't forget, don't try to log in on Monday. Just watch the video before next Wednesday when I'll see you all a week from today. And we will do the second half of Impressionism. And it's very interesting topic. And you can guarantee, I can tell you for sure, 1 or 2 even of the slides that are going to be in the 2 lectures next week about Impressionism. 1, or if not 2 of those slides will be on the final exam. And then I will tell you when I get back, which will be the next lecture, I'll see you live. The Zoom lecture will be a week from today, November 2nd, how the second midterm is going to be given. And I'll also email everybody with a short description of it. It's a much less complicated test to write, to answer, to do, whatever to take. And it's going to be real time. And that'll be on the 9th of May, 9th of November. That's when you'll actually have the image that you'll need to write a short essay. But I'll explain all of that next week. But do watch the posted videos of this coming Monday lecture. Those will be on YouTube along with the 2 lectures I just completed, what we have all done together this week for Romanticism. Those will all be on 3 new postings, in other words, by Friday at 8 p.m. Okay. Any other questions? All right. I hope I'll see some extra credit from some of you, but I know many of you don't feel the need for it, but it doesn't hurt to have a little larger. Oh, yes, I will buy. It's probably going to take me until at least on the 2nd, and it might be the following Monday, the 7th of November, to confirm the date for the walking tour. But I'll say that in class as soon as I have it. I'm working on it now. It takes a while. Like I said, I don't just pick up the phone. I have to walk around and knock on doors. I'll have a route and a starting point and a date for the walking tour for those who want to come for 20 points by, let's say, the beginning of November, that week of November 7th. And it'll either be the 13th or the 20th, depending on which houses I can get us access to. And of course, it's optional, 20 points. All right, see you guys.
I think there's a page missing from my book.
Could be. Yeah, I've seen that happen with some of the editions that I've seen here at campus. I guess some art historians or studio artists tear them out and then use them within their classes. And I never do that. Okay. All right, you guys, have a good weekend. I won't see you. I'll be in Southern California. I won't see you on Monday, but you'll see the lecture if you want to watch it on YouTube. And then I'll see you all one.
Is it
Pardon?
Is it possible for you to send me, send me a print of that last slide you just did?
I can't do that. It's against the
Okay.
rules. You know why?
Okay.
Because it would be, an unfair. I understand why you're asking, and it makes
Okay.
sense. But yeah, we can't do individually for it. But you'll have no trouble finding it on any website where you just plug in Turner and the title, and you should be able to print it out. And then you have the notes. Remember, you don't need to read about to study for any of my tests what's in Stockstead. You do need to read about the context of the overview of that topic before each lecture. But you can, when you study for the test, you should already know this in the midterm. Everybody should know. You just need to focus on the notes you took in class. That's where all of the information you need to use for the slides on the test come from, is my notes. Okay. All right, you guys, have a good week. I won't see you until next Wednesday. All right, have a good 7 days. See you on the 2nd of November. All right, bye.